Welcome to this episode of the Pull Up a Chair podcast. Remember that we may not all think alike, but we can all love alike. And I'm so excited to have my two guests with me today. This is Ed and Debra Lloyd. They've been friends of mine for a long time. We brought them in a couple of weeks ago here at Aldersgate, and we honored them. We just started a new scholarship, a mission scholarship in their name that's going to help send missionaries on short-term mission trips. And so we're glad to have them with us today to just talk a little bit more about how this all got started. And so Ed and Deborah, welcome. Glad y'all are here. So you guys, just the short story is y'all spent a lot of years in Tanzania as missionaries. Kind of tell us a little bit about how that all came to be. So before we even do that, tell us a little bit about what your life was like before you were called to Tanzania. So what was it like when the Lloyds were living in Lubbock, Texas? Just the regular life in Lubbock, Texas. What was that like?
Well, for a number of years, we had owned and operated Rise and Shine donut shops, and before that, Jack and Jill that we changed. But we had sold those a year or so before we went to Tanzania, or I went. And Deborah had gone back to work at Texas Tech. She had worked at Tech, and then she quit there and was helping in the donut shops. And she had gone back with them. And I had started a home inspection business and had been in it, I don't know, maybe a year when things went south. And
Literally,
I went
south, a long way south.
Maybe east or west. I don't know how that is, but anyway, it went somewhere. But we had a pretty normal life, I guess. We had a house out in the country and a donkey, and so we were enjoying life.
So, treehouse for the grandkids.
Treehouse. Yeah. So in Lubbock, a house out in the country, a donkey, and a treehouse for the kids and grandkids. That's normal life, right?
Yeah, sure.
But at that time, things were happening here at Aldersgate with a new missions, grassroots missions organization known as Omega, and it was stationed in Tanzania, Africa. And so, Ed, I think you were one of the first ones on a trip to Tanzania.
Yes, that's correct. The very first mission trip that Omega took over there, I was on it.
Deborah, had Ed ever even been out of the country at that point?
No. In fact, he told people I got out my map of Texas and Tanzania wasn't anywhere on it. And the kids were shocked. They were like, Dad?
In fact, isn't there some story about like you literally got a passport like days before the trip left? Is that correct?
That's true. I didn't have a passport, and we started in like May. I guess. And I thought, okay, I'll go get one. So I went out to the post office, I guess, or wherever you went to get it at that time. And they said, okay, we need your birth certificate. Well, I had it. I had a copy of it.
The hospital copy, the pretty handwritten one, not official.
But it turned out it had never been registered either in the county where I lived or with the state. And so they said, well, you gotta go through that. So this took several months. They wanted all kinds of documentation of early childhood, schools, and just whatever, records. And they wanted original records. Well, those didn't exist. Our house burned when I was 13 years old, and even the elementary school that I went to burned. So anyway, it just took a lot of time. And so I finally got it, and I thought, okay, cool, I can get my passport. So I sent it to the passport office to get my passport. And they came back and said, we're sorry, but the documents that the state used to issue your birth certificate are not sufficient for passport purposes. So we started through this process again and sent me a long list of things I could send them. And I got my passport, on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock by overnight UPS package that I had provided them to send it. And we left Sunday morning at 11 going to Tanzania.
That's just crazy. So you go to Tanzania, Ed, and So what happens while you're there? I don't mean necessarily with your hands, but what happened in your heart while you were there?
Nothing. We got ready to come back, and Jerry had each of us sit down and talk like this in a video, and of course he was trying to collect stuff to come back and promote it. And I said, I'm disappointed because I knew that my call was to go to Tanzania longer term. And I guess I was expecting to get over there and find a burning bush or put my hands on something and then it'd burn them, that, okay, this is why you're supposed to come to Tanzania. And nothing happened. And nothing like that. It was a great trip. We had an incredible thing. We built actually some motel rooms for a church that they were going to rent out on Kilimanjaro for people going up Kilimanjaro. And we came back, and so I said, well, okay, now what, because, and so talked to Jerry, and he said, well, let's do another team real quick because everybody's excited about it. So we tried to do a team in Christmas break, after Christmas. And we had about 10 people signed up, and before Christmas, all 10 had dropped out for various reasons because of it's around Christmas. So Jerry said, well, I'm going in January, and said, you can come go with me and we'll see, what happens. And so I went with him, prepared to stay for 6 months, actually. And Omega found a place where I could stay and work for that 6 months with a German missionary over there that had a facility.
So you knew that you were called to Tanzania long term before you ever stepped on that airplane the very first time.
Right.
Deborah, your call came a little bit differently than that. So how'd y'all reconcile that together?
Well, as much as the Lord spoke to Ed about going, I knew that was, I felt it in my spirit too, not for me, but for him. But we talked about it. We weren't really sure what that would look like. We knew military families did 6 months off and said, well, we can do that. And I like my donkey in the country. And, but I had other responsibilities to tend to and here that were caring for my father and things like that. And so we just thought, well, okay, we'll do it. And then so when he went back and was there for 6 months, he could only be there because his visa was only good for that length of time. Then when he went back, I went for 3 weeks that summer, and just as a visit. And we determined that we could do it, that I could live there. But we still didn't know what that was going to look like, or work, or anything.
That's another thing we need to point out. My call was to show up in Tanzania and do whatever little thing God put in front of me on a day-to-day basis. And so at that point, we had no clue what we were going to do or going to be doing or where we were going to stay or whatever.
Yeah. Can y'all talk to us just a little bit about your call? Because this is whether you go to Tanzania or you're called to go across the street and talk to a neighbor or whatever it may be. But you didn't have some burning bush experience that said, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground, you're going to Tanzania. Like how just talk to us about how you knew you were called to go to Tanzania and be in Tanzania for a long period of time.
Well, the call, I was riding down the road one day in a pickup and I'd been talking to Jerry over the phone. He had just got back from Tanzania and he was trying to set up Omega and he had made some contacts over there and saw some of the needs and the opportunities that they had. And so he'd spelled all that out for me. And a voice said, you need to check this out.
An audible voice or a voice inside your head?
I thought audible.
Yeah.
I don't know,
yeah.
to be honest with you.
I believe it.
It might not have been audible. It wasn't Jerry, I know that. And so as I checked out Omega, and of course we're struggling with a passport and all that stuff, God finally convinced me that, just what I said, he wanted me to be obedient to him, to show up in Tanzania and do whatever little thing he put in front of me. And at the same time, Deborah and I were connecting on it, and we knew that it was a longer term call than just a week, or 2 weeks, and that there was a possibility we might have to be separated, and for some period, and we were okay with that at that point.
Yeah.
And that was one of the, the naysayers. Well, God would never call a man and his wife separate. Well, but he did. And God would never ask you to leave your grandchildren when we were such an active part of their lives. Well, but he did. And there was Ed was like, I'm all in, I'm going. There was the turmoil in me, but I knew in my spirit that was what we were supposed to do.
Yeah. You knew you were called, but there was still that wrestling
Yes.
moment. And I also love y'all's story in terms of calling. God didn't come and say, well, and this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and this is what you're going to do, and this is literally, he called, you went, and you didn't know from day to day what that was going to look like. I think in our Western mentality, sometimes we're so hung up on, well, if God's calling us, he's going to tell us exactly what's going to happen, and that's just not the case. I think y'all's story clearly points that out.
And it wasn't a warm, fuzzy feeling all the time. There were times when you think, oh, wow, that's great. But most of it was just dogging it out and following what God led to get there.
Yeah.
That was.
So when you both decide to go for an extended period of time, like, walk us through that. I mean, you didn't say, well, we're going to leave everything here just in case we're not over there. Like, y'all, walk us through that. Like, what you literally sold everything almost, I think.
I remember the conversation real clearly because we were discussing this. Do we sell everything? And we determined that it was better that we did sell everything, because if we put something, had it all in storage and all that kind of stuff, we would be hanging on to, because we didn't know what that was going to look like. And if we came back, then, we didn't know if it was going to be 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. And that was still just something to hold on to here if we put it in storage.
Oh, wow. That's so powerful, because like I said, this doesn't involve necessarily moving halfway around the world sometimes, but sometimes I think God just calls us to let go of things and surrender, because if we don't, we'll continue to hold on to those things and not move into whatever he's calling us to move into. That's such a powerful word. So y'all did that, literally everything, house, furniture, cars, everything. You moved to a completely different culture on a completely different continent. But y'all's time there, I know God showed up in some amazing ways and did some amazing things. And I know there were lows as well, but just walk us through some of the highs. Like, what in your time there, just share some stories with us in terms of some of the things that God did in your life, or things that you got to witness because you were willing to lay everything down and follow God's call.
Well, when we first went there, we lived at a school right next door to a school in a 3-bedroom mission house called Aldersgate. It was owned by the Church of God, and they had 1,000 students. And so I was we were constructing 3 new dormitories that would house 100 kids each, and I was helping supervise the construction, plus maintenance on the buildings that they had. And I had been there 6 months, right, when Deborah came. So I'd already was situated, and we knew where we were going to live and kind of what we were going to do, but Deborah didn't know exactly what she was going to be doing, and I had no clue. So she brought her sewing machine. So she was going to make dresses for the granddaughters and stuff. When because she had all this time. Well, you tell them what you did.
Well, he came home one day and he said, would you like to, Pastor Suley was an on-campus doctor, and he said they had built her a little clinic there on the campus, and he said, why don't you take Pastor Suley into town and buy her some fabric and make fabric for her little clinic. And it was probably 1, 2, 3, 4 windows. And I went, I did not come to Tanzania to make curtains. I have grandbabies. I could have been making curtains for my grandbabies. But we did. And, of course, you can imagine all the most beautiful African fabric there was. But she picked this stuff out that was just very, very, very ornate and very ravelly and stuff. But we got her curtains made. And then the next thing I knew, up at the Church of God compound, they had these little, what they call bandas, and they were guest houses. And they decided they needed new curtains up there. So there was 7 bandas and 8 bandas. Each one had 2 windows in it. And so I made 2 panels for each for each window. And I just went and took a measurement of the window and went home, and I made all these curtains, and the missionary and I went up there and we were hanging them. But none of the windows were the same size. Some of them were too short, so we had to remake the curtains and everything. But that theme extended all the way through and I was just like angry. I'm supposed to be telling about Jesus while I'm here, but I did have some interesting experiences buying fabric with one of the evangelists there, and we were buying fabric, and he came in, and he was drunk in the store, and she said, and he said, "You're a drunkard," and she said, "Do you know Jesus?" And he said, "No." She said, "Well, you need to know Jesus." And of course, she was very fluent in Swahili, and he went and got his wife and brought him in, and anyway, she prayed for him, and while we were buying fabric for the curtains. But the ironic thing was, through that whole thing, I don't want to say I resented making curtains, but I thought there was bigger and better things to do than making curtains. But my last gift of love, before we left, was the dormitories that Aldersgate built, and I made curtains for those dormitories. But by then it was, anyway, yes.
The small things and the big things, right? Such important lesson. And sometimes I think we fail to see God in the small things, but I know you saw him in the small things and the big things. So y'all have mentioned a couple of times now. So during your time there, you hosted teams from literally all around the world. So just share with us a little bit about your experiences when those teams would come, and kind of, I think our Western mindset is always, as a short-term missionary, if I'm going to be gone a week or 2 weeks or whatever, I'm there to make kind of like what you're saying, Deborah, is like, I'm not here to just sew curtains. I'm here to make a difference and to share Jesus. But tell us, in your experience, I'm sure you saw that happen, but what else did you see happen with many of these teams that came?
Well, one thing I think we need to talk about before we did that, and we shared this story in church, was Deborah was healed one day. We had a meeting set up with Pastor Santoni and Sambasha to the next day to talk about a team. We had a team coming over, and we had to meet with him to be sure everything was lined up, because we were the host. That was something else. For 5 years, we hosted these short-term mission teams and volunteers that came over there. But we had this meeting set up, and woke up that morning, and Deborah was sick. She had a high fever and chills and headache and was weak. Just had to help her out of bed. So we figured, well, this is probably malaria, and we'll go get tested. But we need to call Pastor and tell him that we're not going to make the meeting. So I called him and I explained the situation to him, and he says, "Okay," click, and hung up the phone. But about 10 minutes later, he called back, and he said, "Babu, I have some other pastors and elders here from the church, and we're all gathered in the church, and we're going to pray for Deborah. And we want you to put your hand on her and pray with us." So we did, and he prayed, and a couple other people prayed in Swahili. I have no clue what they said, but it was fervent prayers anyway. And then there was a long pause, just silence on the phone. And then he says, okay, click, hung up again. Well, I'm standing there with my hand on Deborah, and her chills went away, and her fever went away, and her headache went away. And she got up, felt great, normal. So we loaded up and went in and had our meeting with him that afternoon. And when I greeted him that afternoon, I said, Pastor, Deborah was healed. And he said, yes, I know.
There are many stories like that, I know, and I want to circle back around and get to some of those stories as well. But that happened on a day that you were getting ready to host a team that was coming in.
Yeah, that was part of
The teams,
team.
the dynamics of each team was different. There was no two teams the same. Personalities were different, and you could always tell the difference of the teams that had prepared before they came by getting to know each other's personalities and their strengths and their weaknesses, as opposed to one who just says, okay, there's 12 of us going, let's go. It was, if you're very strategic, and I think that was something, Jerry, we talked about when we talked about doing this podcast, was how important it is for teams to be prepared. Even individuals, we had a couple of individuals who came and stayed a couple of months with us, just individual people. But one group came to work at a school for handicapped children, and they were really trying to change the culture of the way Africans viewed a child who was handicapped and or developmentally delayed, and because normally they just shunned them. And the woman who started it had a child who had extreme autism. And anyway, a group of special ed teachers came, and they trained the teachers and how to do things, and really kind of helped. They were built, where were they? They were kind of in a little strip center type thing. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, through Omega's help, the teams that came, they got them a school built, and the impact that those teachers had on training these teachers. And today, they have the school. They have a vocational training for to help these people develop farming techniques. They're raising chickens. They're doing crafts to sell in the markets. So the impact that those teams make, each team had a different impact, and it was just a really neat thing. The other side of it is when they come with expectations. And the teams that would come were just like, I'm here, what do you want me to do? But when you come and you have expectations, and it's, number one, you're in a totally different culture, and you have to understand the dynamics in many instances totally in opposition to our culture, which money issues and that kind of stuff is totally in opposition to Americans. And sometimes people have a real hard time giving up control of that and just blending in with the culture and not trying to bring their culture to them, but trying to reach out. And one time that we were in the habit of teams coming, and we would tell them, you're going to do a home visit, bring a gift, and for their home. And what we would find, we'd be going to a mud hut, and they're bringing a coffee table book of Lubbock, Texas, and they have a pole in the middle of the room with pots. Well, they don't need that. So what we finally started doing is when they got on the ground, we would take them, we'd go buy rice and buy sugar. And there was some struggles with people who came who didn't want to give up control and let God do them. And sometimes dynamics on a team. And with this particular group of special ed teachers, every one of those people in that group were very strong personality leaderships. And one day, like on the third day, we don't know what's happening. And they all just broke down in some way or another and realized that they were under attack. And they finally just let go and just let God do what they were doing in His time. And then they built relationships with these kids. And to this day, I still see lots of communication with them on Facebook.
So I think I hear you guys saying two things. One, the teams that came in a very short time did make an incredible impact
Yes.
in the lives of the people that they were with, and impact that probably is still living today there.
Absolutely. Another, it's easy to get overwhelmed
Yes.
when you come into a third world country like that. And you get to thinking, wow, what little I'm going to do not going to make any difference. Or even what the team's going to do not going to make any difference. Because they see all the needs and the hunger and the poverty and all that. But you're wrong to think that way. God takes these little things and he multiplies them. Maybe he brings another team to follow up on what you're doing. Or like she's talking about step by step, he brought a couple from the Netherlands after we helped them build a building, buy land and build a building. He brought a couple from the Netherlands over there, and they spent a year volunteering to teach and train, and then they raised money and they built a bigger building. So God had multiplied those efforts.
Absolutely.
And we saw that. We had 3 major projects that we worked on, and every one of them, we saw that.
Yeah. So short-term mission teams do make a big difference.
Absolutely.
The second thing I hear you saying is that in a short amount of time, when you had these teams on the ground there, you would see spiritual transformation happen right before your very eyes in their lives in a very short amount of time. I think I hear you saying that loud and clear. And I think oftentimes we think, well, that's the other impact of short-term missions is what happens in someone's life there when they come back. But like you literally saw it from the day you first met someone to the day you said bye, you saw spiritual transformation in their lives.
One team we had, Sabasha was on a foothill of the mountain of Mount Meru, which is the second tallest mountain in Tanzania. And we had a team there, and the pastor, about the second day, said, we're going up the mountain to pray. They had a special place up foothills there
Every
a little
Friday.
bit. Every Friday they went and they prayed, the church elders and pastors and so forth. So, and it was a trail you walked, but it was up, it was tough going up, but and we got about halfway up it, and there was a beautiful valley there, and Deborah said, I just can't go on. I'm give out, and I'm going.
This was after the malaria.
Yeah, and she said, I'm going to sit here and pray while y'all go on up and pray. So she handed me the camera and said, take some cool pictures. So we went up, and as I came over a little rise on this mountain foothill, here was kind of a bowl, and in the center of it was a huge tree, big shade tree. And so as I came over that, here was 25 people, some Tanzanians and some Americans, gathered underneath this tree. And I thought, man, this is going to be great. We're going to get some good pictures. And God said, no pictures. This is my time. So I laid the camera down. And so they started singing some songs. And I looked around, and here was Deborah. I said, I thought you weren't coming. She said, God told me that he would take me to the top of that mountain. And so they sang a few songs, and the pastor prayed, and he went to everybody there and laid his hand on them and prayed. And we had a young lady there. In fact, there were a couple of Tanzanian ladies who were slain in the spirit there. And we had a young lady from Austin who was a vocal agnostic. She just didn't get into this Jesus stuff, and I don't know why she came on the trail, but anyway, she was there. And she was standing there with tears running down her face, and God told Deborah to tell her, I have so much more for you. But the Holy Spirit was alive and well that day under a shade tree on a mountain in East Africa. And the whole team agreed later that this was the most spiritual experience they'd ever experienced in their life.
Wow. Yeah. Such words of encouragement. I just y'all's story, but such words of encouragement for anyone who may be listening that's feeling that nudge, whether it's, like I said, Africa, Guatemala, Spain, or across the street, literally, because you never know what God has in store. And I love the way you say this, Ed, if you just show up, what God has in store. And man, I know this podcast could last days if we talked about all the things that y'all saw God and the Holy Spirit do there. But just, I know y'all have some very memorable stories about that. Just share some of those memorable stories. I'll just start by saying, Deborah, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I know you have a couple of stories. A little girl with a cleft palate, and then I also just love your story of not actually seeing. You didn't see it, but you were part of an exorcism that you didn't even know you were a part of. So just kind of share a couple of those stories with us.
Well, so Pastor Saitoti, who was at Sambasha, he's an evangelist and planting churches, and out in the Maasai country. But there was a little stick church right near the Kilimanjaro Airport, that he wanted to build a church. And so Ed and I went to meet with him and look at it and determine, could this be done? And it was not unusual for kids to come around when we would show up. And so we were in this stick barn type thing, and I turned around and looked in the back of and this was the only little girl sitting in the back of the room. He had a gaping cleft palate. And in the Tanzanian culture, those children were shunned, and if you were in the bush, oftentimes they were put out as a baby into the bush to be taken by the lions, because they just didn't want that in their tribe. And anyway, she was sitting back there, and I just looked at her and smiled, and God literally spoke and said, "You can change this child's life. You can heal this child." And I went, okay. And I didn't know what that meant. And we went back to Dodoma, which was about an 8-hour drive from there. And we'd been working with Andrea Helleman with the Safina Street Kids. And Andrea was a team member on a cleft palate surgery team who came to Kenya every year and did just a week long.
She was a nurse.
Yeah, for 2 weeks long. And she was critical because she spoke the language. And I asked Andrea, how do we get this little girl help? And she said, you just have to get her there. And so we were able to get her there. Pastor Saitoti went with her and her mother because they had never been out of the culture, and she was taken care of and healed. And we went back. We were there a lot, but right before we left, her mother came and got us and took us into their home, and she just thanked us, and she was just, the little girl was just beautiful. Her little mouth was healed.
Wow.
But there was something that came to mind in light of that. But anyway, so the others, there's so many really spiritual things that happen around Pastor Saitoti. This is a funny story. So there was a little deaf girl in the Nanyori who was in, and a lot of people are going to know who Nanyori is. She was in the Sambasha community, and she was around with the kids, and she was very smart. You could just tell by how smart she was. And there was a deaf school in Dodoma, and we talked to Pastor Saitoti about bringing her to Dodoma and let's enroll her in this deaf school. And there was some people from that team that worked at the special ed place who wanted to pay for her schooling. And so Pastor Saitoti brings her and her grandmother to Dodoma, and they were going to stay with us and get her enrolled and then go back. Well, they show up, and I thought, okay, we're going to have Tanzanian food. We're not going to, because Maasai people aren't real excited about trying new things. So we did it, and we were sitting out on our back screen porch, and they just sat there, and it occurred to me, this little girl and her grandmother had never sat at a table to eat. And that was kind of an odd thing. And then the other thing was, this may be too much information, but know how to use the toilet. They use the bathtub. So anyway, the grandmother and Pastor Saitoti leave us with Nanyori, and I, my Swahili and sign language is not too good. And so finally I just went, come on, Nanyori, I got to show you something. Just took her in the bathroom and said, this is how you go to the bathroom. But she was a delight, and she's such a
And we
beautiful.
enrolled in school. She didn't stay with us but a few
Yeah.
days. She
It was a
stayed out of
residential school.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But the exorcism, before we went, I just really prayed, Lord, we're just going to see all this new, spiritual stuff. Do I need to go to school to find out how to do deliverance, And I don't want to say I heard him laugh, but I'm sure he was just going, oh, come on, Deborah. So we had a team from Aldersgate there, and Wade Krausen had a whole classroom of people up in one of the classrooms at teaching them about caring for AIDS patients, and educating them on loving them, and it was okay to love them and take care of them. And he had a translator, and it was just that was real good for the whole community. But Janie Bailey and I were out talking to Pastor Saitoti, and so there's been this woman around the site. Every time anybody comes, she was there, and she was drunkard, she'd push you, she'd spit on you, and Pastor Saitoti would just say, just ignore her. She's a drunkard. And so she was out there kind of hanging around, and I said, does she want us to pray for her? And she said yes. And we found out her name was Baraka, which means blessing. Mm-hmm. So Janie and Pastor Saitoti and I just started praying for her. And then right in the middle of it, he said, stop. And he said, was talking to the lady, you go take those bracelets off. They're the bracelets of a witch doctor. And so she went and took her bracelets off and laid them on the ground. He said, I said, you get rid of them. And she threw them over this cliff. And so anyway, we continued to pray, and she just kind of went down on the ground, kind of went limp, and was real calm and everything. And she got up, Asante Sana, thank you very much, and she left. Well, as we were going down the mountain, we were all talking about everything that was going on in the car, and somebody said, what was that noise out there? And they could literally hear screaming and shrieking coming out of that woman, and Janie and I never heard a thing. Mm. And I would tell you, I'd have been in the car down the mountain in a heartbeat if I'd have heard it. But it was real exciting. And I know there's been some other teams prior to Ed and I going who had some amazing, miraculous experiences in the bush. A child coming back to life after being stillborn, and I mean, a nurse had already determined that this child was dead in the womb, and they said, but they came back and said that the child was born alive. But I mean, that there's been lots of stuff that's happened, and just in the day-to-day things, just expecting, that this child can't take her examinations, not because she's ill, but because somebody's put a spell on her. Mm. And watch a doctor address the spiritual aspect as opposed to the physical aspect. And he was a friend of ours who was a doctor in the bush, and that was a common part of his practice, was addressing spells and doing deliverance and working with families to try to not do that.
Wow. It just amazes me, y'all. Those stories just kind of roll off your tongue. Like, it's almost like it's still so supernatural, but it was almost like it came so natural for y'all while you were there. So speaking of witch doctors, by the way, y'all became quite the witchers yourself while you were there, right?
Diviners.
Diviners. So not witch doctors, but diviners with witching rods, literally. So witching rods meaning finding water, and which is a problem there. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, Safina, one of the organizations that we work with, and the stories, a lady missionary from New Zealand had worked with them in the past. And Safina ministers to kids who live on the street. The word Safina is a Swahili word that translates as refuge.
Or ark.
What?
Ark. Refuge or an ark. Yeah.
Noah's Ark was Safina, and also the reed basket that Moses was found in, translated Safina. So this is a refuge for kids who live on the street. A lady who had worked with them a couple of years before just showed up one day, got off the bus and said, called them, said, here, I'm here. She said, I've got money and I want to buy you some land. So they picked out 3 sites, a 3-acre site close to town, 5 acres a little further, and about 20 acres out 30 miles. And said, okay, which one do you want to buy? And she said, I want to buy all 3 of them. So she did. So then we came back. I think we were gone at the time, and we came back, and they were telling us about this land. I said, well, Pastor, what, now you have it, but what are you going to do with it? So he said, well, this 3-acre tract close to town, we want to build 2 foster homes that'll house 30 kids each and foster parents so that we can take kids off the street and put them in a home type environment. And with 3 acres, we've got place for volleyball and basketball and soccer and all this. And the 20-acre tract, he wanted to plant 1 acre of grapes as a cash crop. They grew a lot of grapes there. And the 5-acre tract, they were going to grow corn for feed, for food. But this 3-acre tract didn't have any water. It was just raw land. There was no water, no electricity, just out there. So we came home, and the Sunday before we were to go back on Monday to Tanzania, we spoke here at Aldersgate. And we just laid this out that they had got this land and long-term vision Patrick had for this 3-acre tract, these 2 houses, but they were going to cost about $70,000 a piece. And we had to get water, which at the time we estimated $25,000 to get water out there. And so this was just long-term, as God provided. That's something that was in the future. When I got through talking, we came back to the foyer, and a gentleman here from the church came up, and he said, you say these 2 houses hold 30 kids each? Yeah. 60 kids that you can get off the street. Yeah. And it cost about $70,000, yeah, so $140,000 for both of them. Yes, sir. He said, well, I'm in. He said, I want to get those kids off the street. And so we left, and Monday morning we left going back. And of course, it's 24 hours to get there and then an 8-hour drive to where we lived and so forth. By the time we got there, we had an email from Jerry out at Omega. He said, I got a check for $140,000, and Aldersgate has subscribed to the $25,000 to do the water project. So we get started.
Just show up.
Just show up. That's right. Just get going. So we want to be good stewards of the church's money. We hired a hydrologist. They had a portable seismograph deal. And I had worked with them before because I had done water projects with Lance Weil out of San Antonio and installing pumps and so forth. Anyway, we called these people and said, come out and survey this 3 acres. We want to drill a well, but we want you to tell us where. So they did. They picked 3 sites. The land sloped. It was a rocky hill, and it sloped down through a little draw that came through a wash. And they picked 3 sites down in this wash on the low end. But she said one of them is very strong, better than the other 2. But you're going to have to go deep. Said the water's 200 meters down. And we were estimating 100 meters initially because that was kind of standard that I'd seen as it went around the country. So we went and hired a drilling company to come out and drill on this site. Well, we went 7 meters, which is
2.5 football fields.
What?
2.5 football
2.5
fields.
football fields deep. It had nothing but gray granite, no water. So we pulled out and said, okay, well, now what? What are we going to do? And another missionary couple that we had met who lived out west of us was coming through town, and they called and said, hey, we're coming through town, and we'd like to stop by. And we said, well, great, come on by and spend the night. We had a 3-bedroom house. So they came up, and we were telling them about the water thing, and he said, come out the truck, let me show you. So I went out there, and he pulled out 2 divining rods. We call them witching rods. He said, we use these. He said, we've drilled a couple of wells, and we've hit water both times using these rods. So he showed me how to do it, and we were walking around the house, and it worked. I had to walk across a spot, and the rods crossed and were pulling down, and he said, well, that could have been an electric line under there. Said that would do it too, but we got to looking at what it was, water line, incoming water line under the house. So he left, and so the next day we went down to the welding shop and bought us 2 welding rods, and bent them, and went out there. So after they had worked for me, I thought, oh man, we'll see. So I walked all over that place, and those little rods didn't do a thing. So I handed them to Deborah and said, okay, you try it. So she starts, and of course, first thing you know, she's all excited. Ooh, these rods are, they're crossing and they're pulling down and stuff. And so she found a couple of places up on top of this rock on the opposite end from where the hydrologist had found. And we marked 3 spots with a little rock, just picked up a rock and put it up there. So we went back and took the rods to Patrick, the pastor that we worked with, and said, okay, you go try it. So they had 14 kids living with them, but 4 of them were theirs, but the rest of them were street kids that they had brought in. Yeah. Anyway, he took the whole family out there, and they all tried it, and he said they had a lot of fun. Some of them it worked, and some of it didn't. So he said, I've marked some spots. So, okay, let's go see. So we got out there, and the 3 spots he marked were right on top of the 3 spots that Deborah had marked.
Wow.
And one of them was a very strong, the strongest. Not only that, but probably 6 months before that, we had a team from Lake Ridge just over there, and we went out and prayed over this land. And we were up on top of that hill, and Jerry Kruger, assistant pastor, knelt and poured a bottle of water. And it was, 20 feet from that
from
spot.
where one of those spots was. Wow.
So we drilled. Well, the first thing we did, we went back out.
We went back to Aldersgate to tell them the problem.
Yeah, they were going to have to drill again. But there was a Catholic organization that had the drilling rig, and we knew the father out there, Father Tim, and he was from Texas actually, and we had a good connection with him. And so we went out there to him and said, okay, Father Tim, you're the pro. You tell us, are we crazy or not? We had this seismograph crew come in, and we had a dry hole, and now we've used these rods, and we think we found another spot. Would we be crazy to drill there? And he started laughing. He said, not at all. He said, I do business most of my drilling is with other Catholic organizations. And he said, I don't have a single pastor that will use the seismograph. They all use divining rods.
Wow.
And he said, sometimes they miss. He said, they're not 100%. But he said, there's one old guy out there been doing it for years, and said, he'll just pick up a piece of wire off the ground and said, he can tell you how deep the water is and how much of it's there, Wow. And so he said, I don't think you're crazy at all. So we went back and we said, okay, we're going to drill. And at 187 meters, we were getting awful nervous.
Through solid rock.
Pardon? Yeah, through solid granite.
Yes.
That's where you find water in countries granite, and it's not not like here where you got water nearly anywhere you want to drill. If you're going to hit water because of the aquifer. Over there, you're hitting crevices in the granite that the water has come into. So we drilled through, and in 187 meters hit water.
Wow.
It hit good water, a
Wow.
lot of water. Of course, it was so deep, it cost more. We had to put a pump, submersible pump, and a generator, but again, Aldersgate stepped up.
You just show up and see God work. I think probably if y'all could summarize your entire experience in Tanzania, it would be just show up and see what God's going to do. I think it just y'all's story, your testimony, and so because of that, we wanted to honor y'all. Omega Mission donated some seed money to Aldersgate Church, and just recently we invested in these two as well with that seed money, and we've launched the Ed and Debra Lloyd Scholarship Fund, Mission Scholarship Fund. And what that fund does is it helps people who are called and just want to go show up wherever it may be on a short-term mission trip. It helps them finance part of that trip, and that'll exist in y'all's name. And we would love if you feel called or led to give to that fund, to do that. You can go to Aldersgate's page, aldersgate.online, and you can give to that fund there, and we would certainly appreciate you doing that. And I feel like you're probably going to want to do that after listening to these two on this podcast. And we couldn't think of any better way to use that money than to launch this scholarship fund in y'all's name. And just all because you heard a voice that said, show up. And just so appreciate you guys being willing to share with us on the podcast today what happens when you're willing to just show up. So any concluding thoughts, things that y'all would want to share that you'd want to leave us with? I know, again, we could go for hours here probably, but anything that y'all would want to just leave us with as we sign off on the podcast today?
Well, first of all, you heard Pastor call me Babu.
Yeah.
All right, Babu is Swahili for grandfather.
Yeah.
I have gray hair. So they call me either,
But you have hair, so.
Yeah, well, that's true. But they call me over there Babu or Mzee Eddie. They don't like Ed. That's too close, too short. Mzee is old man. So they either call me Old Man Eddie or Babu. And you heard them call Deborah. They don't like Deborah either. That's too short. They won't string that out. Just a cultural thing that we came to accept, and it was good. The other thing is, when you go on any trip, whether it's a week or a year or 10 years, whatever, keep your focus on God. It's easy to get overwhelmed.
Yes.
You see all the needs, the poverty, the hunger. And if you don't focus on God, you won't stay there. Because you get focused on all that and you say, wow, I can't do it. And if you're on a short-term mission team, you get to thinking, wow, I'm not going to have an impact. I'm not going to do anything because it's so great. The needs are so great, and I'm so going to do so little, or even your team is going to do. But as I said, God multiplies those things. So you keep your focus on God and do the best you can. Just show up, and you'll do okay. Get up every morning and get up close and personal with Jesus Christ and stay there. And you'll do well.
It's a good word, whether you're in your own home or halfway around the world. I think I know the answer to this question, but what would you say to someone who's listening and is probably feeling that tug either to a short-term or long-term mission trip, or the trip may be literally a trip across the street? What would you say to someone who's feeling that tug but is a little bit resistant to actually stepping into where they're being called? What I think I know the answer to this, but what would you say?
I'd tell them to show up.
I knew
and let God do it.
I knew that was going to be the answer, but I wanted it to come from your mouth. So.
And Rick Burkhalter, he was a pastor at St. Matthew at the time. We were kind of communicating a little bit during that time. Well, while Ed was gone and I was making preparations. And I was just expressing how frustrating it was to be going without a plan. And Rick said, Deborah, God's will is not a spot on the wall. It's the wall.
Oh, wow. That's good.
And that's so true. And he's going to put doors up when he doesn't want you to. He's going to put you where he wants you to be. If you, just like Ed said, if you focus on the wall and not the spot on the wall.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, that's really powerful. So, well, Ed, Deborah, Babu, and Deborah, thank you guys so much for being willing to come and share with us today on the podcast. And I know I've had to wipe away tears several times over here, so I know others have as well. And you've inspired many. And I just appreciate your willingness to do exactly what you're encouraging others to do, and that is to show up. And I know both of you well enough to know that didn't end the day you came back from Tanzania. You continue to show up, and so appreciative and grateful for that, and really honored to honor you guys in this way with this scholarship. And I can't wait, maybe even to sit across the same table with other people in the future who've benefited from your scholarship, and God's radically spiritually transformed their lives as well. So thank you guys both. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pull Up a Chair podcast. Just remind you as we sign off today, again, we may not all think alike, but we can all love alike.